Hello, and welcome to A Dash of Salt. I'm Dr. Shelley Ann, and I'm so glad you're here. Whether you stumbled upon this podcast by accident or you're here because the subject drew you in, welcome. SALT is an acronym for Society and Learning Today. This podcast was created as an outlet for inviting fresh discussions on sociology and learning theories that impact your world. Each episode includes a wide range of themes that focus on society and everyday learning, whether formal or informal. So let's get stuck in, shall we? Welcome to A Dash of Salt. Today I'm joined by Maeve O'Regan. Maeve is a chartered occupational psychologist with over 20 years of experience working in higher education in the UK and Ireland. She's worked as a careers advisor, primarily with students with disability in the Dublin City University. Maeve has also worked as a student learning development advisor in Trinity College Dublin over the last decade, helping undergraduate and postgraduates to maximize their academic potential and skill. She's currently on a career break and has just completed her PhD Viva in the School of Education in Trinity College. Maeve's research is an exploration of the experiences of individuals who have completed a PhD on a part-time basis in different universities in Ireland. She's interested in access to educational opportunities and inclusion, particularly for learners who have been marginalized or overlooked in research, policy, and practice. I'm delighted to have you on the podcast today to speak with you about the challenges that part-time PhD researchers face, specifically because they are part-time students.
Thanks very much, Shelley. It's great to be here.
So firstly, Maeve, congratulations on successfully defending your PhD research. Well done to you. It must be satisfying to know that the hardest part of the work is now behind you. I'm really looking forward to talking to you about your research and your area of interest. Will you tell us a little bit more about yourself and about your program of research?
Okay, Shelley, I suppose, golly, I don't know where to start. I suppose, my background is in psychology and occupational psychology. And then I've had a very kind of diverse career after that. And I have worked with people who are ex-prisoners and their families, as well about access to education and training. I've worked with students with disabilities as a careers advisor in DCU, as you mentioned, and then more recently as a student learning advisor. And what I noticed in student learning advisory role in Trinity was that we were seeing more students at postgrad level, and we were seeing more PhD students. And then we were getting more requests for doing outreach. So going into an institution connected with the university and going off campus to deliver training on academic skills, motivation, writing, off-site. And then we started to develop more requests for online for the students who were not available 9 to 5 at all. And I became very aware of this idea of people's lives being very busy, and that maybe the assumption that the learner is physically on campus and able to access support and programs and communities within the university might not be a reality for everybody. I also was one of the volunteers on the Trinity Access Programme. I was one of their interviewers for the mature students. I loved doing that, to hear people's stories when they returned to education or had maybe not completed education, were coming back as mature learners. But what I noticed is that the addresses of people 10 years ago, everybody was based around the Dublin area. More recently, now it's people coming from Drogheda, people coming from Carlow, people commuting. And this has been kind of captured in the UK, where there's research now on the commuter learner and the idea of not physically being able to access campus during 9 to 5 and how it affects your learning. So I thought, well, we're seeing a lot of doctoral candidates, and I'm hearing a lot of, it was full-time PhD students that we saw. I'm hearing a lot of stories about people balancing work, having babies, having grown-up kids, managing finances, all this busy world. And I just thought, we're not seeing part-time PhD students. Now, why not? Because I also saw that there's a trend that there's a higher level of enrollments in part-time PhD students in Ireland and worldwide. Actually, we have now a 72% increase in part-time PhD enrollments in Ireland over the last decade. Now, it's still not a huge figure. It's from 920 to 1,625, from 2008 to 2018, but it's a very growing area. So the idea of a learner with a lot going on and maybe limited access to the academic institution really interested me. And also most of our PhD part-timers are within the university sector, so that's growing now with technological universities, and within an arts, humanities and social science field. So that was what interested me when I started this research as a part-time PhD myself in 2016.
Tell us a little bit more about the concept of invisible learner. I know that's something that we've kind of talked about in the past together, what an invisible learner is. And if you can tell us what that encompasses and maybe give us some examples.
Okay, the invisible learner, it can be quite complicated to separate these little bits. There's different types of doctoral programs. And say that the typical doctoral program recognized in European policy and practice is the full-time PhD candidate, preferably located within the academic institution in a community of researchers, preferably funded. And there's kind of, again, an idea that this is a young researcher. This is the framework that we have as a traditional learner. So that's your visible learner, and that policy and practice is designed around helping a PhD researcher on a full-time basis to progress through their program over 3 to 4 years. Now, there's also programs for part-time candidates, doctoral education programs that are not the PhD. They're the doctorate in education and the professional doctorates. Now, these tend to be designed more for people who are part-time, who are working, who are more mature, and will study after a day's work or meet once a week. And these students tend to be within a cohort. So they're recruited on a part-time basis over 4 years, and they start together. They'll have a very structured piece maybe, which is around assignments, and then we'll have the thesis at the end. I actually interviewed a few people who've done a part-time doctorate or doctorate in education, and the challenges are the same. If you're doing a thesis, if you're working, whether you're full-time, part-time, these things will be challenging no matter what your circumstances are. But if you're in a program designed on the basis that you're part-time and you're mature and you're with a group of others, there's a community within that. If you're a full-time PhD researcher, there's an assumption that you can access college and the campus environment between 9 to 5. And there are two assumptions. There's a middle invisible learner that I spoke about, which is the part-time PhD candidate. So instead of doing their research over 4 years, the part-time PhD candidate will tend to study for 6 years, 5 to 6 years. There's no framework for recognizing this in the way that the program is delivered. So there's a very rough kind of shape around the PhD because obviously each university will have its own strengths, its own culture, its own way of supporting learners, its own kind of philosophies really. But in general, there's kind of 3 stages. So a student will come in, starting their PhD, and they'll have an orientation or coursework within first year. Then they will have a mid-stage transfer or confirmation, which is kind of like your NCT or your driving test to see, have you got legs under your research? Has it got mileage to go the road? And then the end stage is your viva and your thesis submission, which is, can you produce research as an original researcher? Can you make a contribution to knowledge that wasn't there before? And that's the shape of the PhD. And that shape of it, which has been very unchallenged, is based on a 3 to 4 year candidature. So if you're doing this over 5 to 6 years, you're part-time, so you're not really there because you probably have other commitments and you're working and you're caring, and your main job is probably the one that pays your mortgage or your bills, your rent. And this is a second thing that you're doing to kind of progress with your career or personally or educationally. You're invisible. It's not designed with you in mind. And actually there's researchers called Newman and Rodwell. They're Australian researchers, and they have talked about the invisibility of the part-time PhD learner in research, in policy and practice. We know nothing really about a part-time PhD researcher except that they're not full-time. There's nothing in policy about recognizing part-timers in the structure of a program. It is more, well, it's a concession at a departmental level. If you have to be part-time, fair enough. Or if you're full-time and you have to go part-time because your personal life has become challenging, fair enough. But it's not designed with this in mind or thought of in any way in terms of the positives possibly with being a part-time researcher, or the possibility that, maybe somebody who's a part-timer brings other skills with them. So this is why I wanted to explore this, because it's such an unknown,
You were saying that part-time PhDs don't have the ability to access funding. Is that so? Did I hear that right?
That's definitely been something historically in research, that part-time PhD candidates tend to be self-funding. That's what research would suggest. In general, as I said, the PhD is designed more with the full-time researcher in mind, and that is something that is a common in practice across Europe, and a common understanding. When you read about the PhD guidelines, it's talking about this full-time researcher. Funding tends to be more targeted towards your full-time researcher. I think it might be opening up slightly more, but as I said, the invisibility of this type of learner, or their voice in any kind of a way to inform policy and practice, it's a bit of a grey area. My own participants, the 18 people who finished a PhD, I did a preliminary study to see who would I look at, like what stage of the PhD would I look at, what department, how would I even look at a part-time PhD candidate. What came out of that, I looked at full and part-time candidates from a single university, and those who had finished or were finishing their PhD had a better sense retrospectively of what had worked at each stage to help them to progress, than people like me who were kind of in the middle and didn't really have a benchmark of what we were supposed to do next or what would work next. And I'd only gone as far as each stage myself. So retrospectively, I looked at people who had finished a PhD part-time. And of these 18, they were from 5 different universities. A lot of them were funded by their employer. So this was interesting. So if you work in a higher education sector or within education, some people worked for employers that were very supportive and funded them. So that's a piece that maybe part-time researchers are funded, some of them, but this again, we need to unearth a little bit more beyond my study to see about where the funding is coming from. But a lot actually would fund themselves, especially if you worked in a sector where the PhD wasn't very valued or recognized.
What are some of the accesses that full-time PhDs enjoy that part-time PhDs struggle to find or just don't have access to? What are some that you saw and heard from your research experience?
I think the biggest barrier, looking at both the full-timers and part-timers for my preliminary study and then for my main study, is the experiences were challenging. No matter what way you're doing a PhD, the experiences are very challenging. I don't know, and again, in terms of access, I don't know if this is an Irish thing. I have lived in the UK as well, but as a culture, we're a nation of talkers, and we really like that face-to-face contact. So I'd say the difference for full-timers was the informal connections within the academic institution, just by the nature of being there 9 to 5. And if you were a talker and you were confident, or you were even positioned within a room with other PhD candidates and you were in your department, you could knock on doors. And that's what a lot of people said to me who were the full-timers. Oh, sure, listen, if I need to find something out, I just knock on the door. The administrators are great. They're really nice. Or my supervisor's down the hall. Or I always bounce ideas off somebody who's in the same office as me, who's also doing a PhD. So there's that informal kind of community. The coffee culture, again, I don't know if that's a very Irish thing, but if you're in a space where you can have a coffee with other people, or access seminars and these networking opportunities, they're the bread and butter, I think, for a lot of the full-time PhD candidates that the part-timers couldn't access by the nature of tending not to be there 9 to 5. There was an intentionality about the way the part-time learner engaged with the academic institution. It was often outside of hours. One of my participants, actually, she did a lovely story. She talked about the library, that the library was brilliant as a point of access for part-time PhD candidates, and for anybody really, because it's a physical space, but it's also a virtual space that you can connect to 24/7 out of hours, and you can access resources, excuse me, and you can hear about training coming up. But she said, and a lot of people said this, both in both my preliminary and my main study, I love the library. The staff are wonderful. They're so supportive, especially if you're a part-time PhD candidate and you're going in on a wet weekend, or you're like a vampire going in there at night or on a Sunday. That physical connection was often the only point of contact that some of my part-timers had, or maybe only their supervisors. So they miss out on a lot of those experiences. Now, equally, I had international students and maybe people who said that they were quite shy. and wouldn't have been proactive in seeking out information, or found it very easy, excuse me, maybe not knowing the culture of the academic institution. So it's a wider issue than being part-time. You can be physically on campus, but if you haven't got the confidence to knock on doors, if you don't know the people that might be able to help you, like what I noticed is to successfully go through the PhD process and to have a positive experience and to be connected with others, we have this culture very much in Ireland about the face-to-face contact. It's the way that we seem to relate to each other, and we're very comfortable about that informality. So if you are a full-time PhD candidate, or you're in campus a lot and you've access to these seminars, the physical spaces where you can have a coffee, a desk, and where you can chat to people, it makes a difference. I mean, you can be a part-time student and have a desk, and in fact a lot of the universities think would facilitate that. But if you don't have that or you don't push yourself forward, you can end up being very isolated. You could be invisible on campus. I actually had one participant in the early in my preliminary study who was an international student. She was from South America. She was a researcher within her own university back home. She had a family, she was married. You think about that, like you're in Ireland in a bedsit in Drumcondra or something, and your family are way, way across in another time zone. I think this is something you could relate to, Shelley. And that your contact with them is, I'm dying for that, would have been the Skype phone call at 9 o'clock in the evening. I'm dying for my husband to come over, and we're going to go to Paris, and we're going to go crazy and what have you. But your world is actually quite isolated. If you can't find an in the physical space, you can get very lost. And this particular participant, she actually used to contact her friends who were the researchers in the university where she worked in her own home country, to find out, can anybody tell me about how I access this resource? Does anybody know what a lit review would involve? Because she didn't have the confidence to put up her hand in any of the training sessions she went to access the resources that were physically there. She said her real angel was a full-time PhD candidate who was really, really positive, and they were all together in the same space. It was like a kind of a work space where they felt it was like a job. They were all there 9 to 5. But this other full-time candidate who was Irish and really kind of full of personality would say to her, right, so we're doing a breakfast. They're doing a kind of cheap breakfast over there in the canteen. We're all going to go over 11 o'clock every Friday. And that became a thing. And that became a space for those outsiders who, didn't necessarily have the social in to or to connect, or didn't have the in even to kind of navigate the website, or talk to somebody about, oh, how do I find out about funding, or this, that, the other, or you talk to this person or that person or the other. They didn't have that in. So you need to either physically be there, you need the personality, you need a catalyst, usually another full-time researcher to help you. So the part-timers didn't have that. Most part-timers were not there 9 to 5. And when you go on campus at 6 o'clock in the evening, it's a hugely different experience. You can't sidle up to somebody and say, oh, that was a really interesting talk, wasn't it? Or are you going to that thing in the library? Or, oh, I hear the counselling service is amazing. So you miss a lot. And I think that intentionality about the way the part-timer engages with the academic institution for short focused visits, often just with a supervisor or a service, needs to be made more explicit, and we need more online and face-to-face supports to connect that person in.
Mm-hmm. What have you seen as the effects that COVID has had on maybe those who were mid-research and part-time PhDs, and the barriers that they had experienced? What made me think about this was that idea of the outsider that you were talking about, and the sense of isolation. And obviously over this past year and a half now, even full-time PhDs have now kind of lived that outsider experience and that idea of being isolated. So have you seen some flip-flop, or tell us a little bit about sort of what you may have seen, some of the differences or some of the changes that have happened?
Yes, it's actually funny. Just to give a kind of an anecdote that sort of relates to this, I have a friend who's a neighbour who's in college with me, and she's got quite a serious medical condition that she says pre-COVID she was considered very kind of unusual, because she'd say, oh, sorry, is there a child in the house with a cough, or I'm not able to mix because of X, Y, and Z. So she had to isolate herself from others because of her medical condition. She said COVID equalised it. It was a level playing field. Well, I would say the same about doing a PhD, or even educating or working or being a learner from your primary school infant or your infant teacher or your remote worker or your PhD candidate, COVID was a level playing field. We all suddenly were in this world where we could not physically connect with each other, and God, do we miss it. Now, technology has really kind of stepped up, but I think what it's also highlighted is the gaps in what technology and human contact, where there's a gap between the two. And I think that's where we really need to flip the way we look at education and learning and connecting. I have a very good friend who's a full-time PhD candidate who's now gone home to her own country. So she's physically at a remove from campus. She no longer has her access to her network and her supports. She's active on a WhatsApp group. But again, how is she going to progress with her PhD? What can be the footholds that she can use to climb up in the absence of that physical contact? What about the web resources? What about even that kind of dynamic informal communication? Is she regularly meeting with her supervisor online? Is she keeping herself connected? Do we notice if people drop off? And I think that that's why there's this real danger about, the lack of physical contact is the invisibility of a learner who may just slip away and it's not noticed. So again, I think, yeah, COVID has been a level playing field, and it actually really fed into what my research was trying to do. When I started looking at the part-time PhD candidate, not a popular subject, and to be quite honest with you, it's still very, very new. There's pockets of support, but it's not something that's hugely recognized. But when I was thinking, how do you look at the experience of a learner who's not physically and socially in the campus environment? So literally, it's close your eyes, put your hands over your eyes, and now describe how that interaction happens and what's missing from it, and where is technology filling the void. Well, lo and behold, here we are now in this COVID world where these experiences are everybody's experience. And however difficult this pandemic is, there's a huge opportunity within that for us all to reflect afterwards on, how did I connect in? How did I engage with the institution? How did the institution engage with me? How were these different ways of communicating or providing information or helping me to belong or progress? That has to be a two-way conversation.
Yeah.
Both between the learners out in their world at home on their computers and the academic institutions, so we can design education systems and support thinking about somebody who's stuck at home in Sweden, or stuck at home in Venezuela or whatever, or in Carlow or in Milltown Malbay or wherever, even south of Dublin and not able to go into Trinity, whatever. We have to just look at inclusion in a way beyond and as well as somebody being mature, international, full-time part. Now we have to look at what else is going on in people's lives and where are they situated in relation to that academic environment, even on a time zone, to connect those pieces to help the learner. When I was working in student learning development, I remember meeting a PhD student. He was brilliant and he was exhausted. Every time you meet him, he was absolutely exhausted. He didn't socialize, didn't mix at all, and was really demoralized and deflated, even though he was academically doing very well, because his network of support was his girlfriend, who was across the other side of the world, in a different country, in a different continent. And he used to connect with her every evening, and it would be midnight Irish time. So when he came in, he was missing his morning kind of connections with others. He was disengaging with campus and he was just disconnected. So connection has to be looked at beyond face-to-face to the other ways that we hold people.
Yeah, and in that whole, I'm wondering if that this whole thing with COVID is going to make universities look at the balance between their full-time PhDs and their part-time PhDs, and look at it in more of an equitable manner. That both, that they won't, that the invisible will now no longer be invisible, that all will be visible, and that, all, because no matter whether it's part-time PhD or full-time PhD, everybody's working towards a significant contribution in the field of knowledge and whatever it is that you're studying and you're researching. And so it means that the part-time PhD is no less important than the full-time PhD. And so, maybe universities out of this, coming out the other side, that along with the publication and the dissemination of your own research will help to spur the universities on to make those realizations and to start making some changes to make it more equitable. One of the things that you had said a little while back, but I did want to bring it up again, was that you were talking about the significance of the work environment and the work role, and that PhDs who are working full-time and doing PhDs part-time, that environment. What do you think the significance is of work and that type of environment on influencing that PhD progression to completion? And what is really actually meant by that?
Well, I think for my participants in my main study, and I think all of the individuals contributing to the study, is the PhD is as individual as a fingerprint. Everybody's study was as unique as a fingerprint in terms of their journey, whether it was in the balance of being single, being partnered up, having older children, younger children, no children, caring responsibilities. It's very individual. But within that, for my part-time PhD and completed learners, the other factors were the supervisor. So if you had a very experienced supervisor, this could be your main plug into navigating the PhD within the institution. A supervisor who would say, oh yeah, I tell you, this is how you get contact with this person. This is how you find out about where these resources are, training are. So a supervisor who was very well established and really knew the university well was a real plus. I think that would be the same for anybody doing doctoral studies. An inexperienced student and supervisor was a challenging combination. So if you had somebody who was a part-time PhD candidate returning to education after 20 or 30 years, had a supervisor who was also new, hadn't progressed people to completion, and was navigating the process, the two together were kind of in the dark. So again, I think there's something there about the institution supporting not just the learners, but their own staff in terms of training and development and helping those new supervisors, to develop within the role. So the supervisor was a key factor. The institution and its systems and its processes, again, was a real factor. And I'll bring this back to the point you asked me about work. So again, that can be challenging if it's not explicit. Where do I go to get my email? Where do I go to register? Or, how do I progress? How do I find out about the guidelines? Those things are challenging. If you're working full time, say one of my participants, she worked in a university sector in one part of the country and was doing her PhD 200 kilometers away. So she had a problem with her IT. She could something wrong with her email, her access. She couldn't get access because she was working full time. She was the sole person responsible for a particular department. She couldn't just up and leave and come in. She had to take a day's leave. Now her management were highly supportive of her, and it was a culture where the PhD was valued. And she literally had to physically go down after failing to resolve her problem online or virtually and being passed from pillar to post. She had to go down to the university, grab a full-time PhD candidate who worked in the university, who was also on her course, get them to bring her over to the IT place and say, lads, I'm not leaving till this is sorted today. So that's where work and just the nature of working full-time and maybe your location of your job and the nature of your role in relation to your PhD, where you're physically doing it, is an issue. If you're doing a part-time PhD in an environment where it's valued, say if you worked in a higher education institution, for some of my participants, this was great because they'd seen a real life problem and they had access maybe to participants and they could feed their research into their work. So the two dovetailed together, and this was quite a really, really good combination. So this is where work and PhD and work and research really complemented each other. And equally, they had great experiences, some of my participants, of they had a network of people to talk to. somebody else who'd gone through the research process, maybe other colleagues who'd done a doctorate in education or a PhD or another form of level 10 qualification. So there was a world there where you could moan about it, or you could share experiences or learn how to write and publish. So your community of researchers, if you couldn't get in the academic institution, you could compensate through your work environment. Now, alternatively, I had one other participant. Well, I had a few, but I mentioned one in particular because I just thought she was so amazing. The story of anybody doing level 10 doctoral qualifications is about resilience. And that's what a lot of the quotes are about. You damn well have to be resilient to get through it. And that's it. But this particular participant, she worked in a sector where the PhD wasn't valued. Nobody else had done one. She was full-time in a job. There was no time off, no support for it. She didn't know anybody personally who had a PhD. She had very little access to the academic institution, tended to go there after hours, and really had no foothold in terms of progressing. So that's where her work environment and her distance physically and socially was very wide from the academic institution. So she linked into doctoral forums. And this is something that's been quite unexplored, like blogs and doctoral forums. And a lot of my participants said this at 10 o'clock in the evening, when you're there in front of the computer and you need to tap into, advice or motivation of some kind. The PhD forums really were her footholds for that dynamic interaction, the progression. And she said, I depended on the kindness of others, of strangers. It was me and other academics and students in the UK and Australia and all around the world. And they were my community. And I gave back when I finished my PhD, and I gave back to them. So this is a really untapped world of dynamic interaction. I had another group of part-time PhD candidates, and they set up their own self-generation peer network. Now, they grabbed each other on day one when the supervisor or the staff member said, right, who here is part-time and full-time? They grabbed onto each other, and they happened to be a good mix. So they kept in touch throughout their PhD as their own network, even though they all worked in separate institutions. And they literally, one of them said to me, we were on the email every 20 minutes. When we were coming up to submitting, we were all on the email to each other. We never met. We never needed to. And others had more face-to-face kind of networks that they built up. And that was their community. So there's all these different rich pieces of it. But work as a facilitator in terms of the type of work you do, and work as a barrier was a big issue. And I think it really highlights maybe that institutions need to be aware where a learner is coming from before they start a PhD, and that some, I'd say even like myself now, would need maybe a bit more orientation and help to bridge that gap from the practitioner world I've come from, or working as a researcher donkeys years ago, to the gap that needs to be filled to get to help me to become a researcher. Now, I was lucky. There's a lot of my colleagues in the student counselling service and student learning development within college. I was lucky. I knew a lot of people, as well as the academic staff in my department, who were really able to help. But many don't, and I think it needs to be addressed.
One of the things that I am curious about is completion rates. Specifically, is there evidence of additional time that's needed, or those who just couldn't complete the PhD journey? What did you see in your research?
Well, that was something that I hoped would kind of frame my research about completion rates, because of course there's a lot of studies on non-completion or length of time to completion across the board, I think, for full and part-time PhD learners. But again, the part-timer tends to be known as having the 5 to 6 year or longer kind of route. There's no definition of a part-time PhD candidate. There's no unified definition of part-time, which is really difficult. So it can include somebody who was full-time and then went to part-time, as well as somebody who was part-time throughout. So actually, there's a new, the Irish survey of student engagement. There's a survey on student engagement. They've recently developed a postgrad researcher survey of engagement, and that was in 2019. And that's one of the things they highlighted. There isn't a single term to define a part-time PhD learner. Some it's by type of enrollment, some it's by full-time equivalency, some it's by the type of modules they do, or by funding status, or so there's no unified term. So therefore, capturing completion statistics, there's no way to really be sure how the learner is defined within completion statistics, or if at all. So it's kind of a grey area. My own participants, the 18 who completed a part-time PhD, some of them were early completers. Again, there's this issue, supposing for those who worked in a higher education, managing the full-time job and doing the part-time PhD, but doing the part-time PhD with the purpose of maybe getting a full-time role, or going for a promotion or changing a job. It was really important to get that PhD over the line quickly. Another thing that people mentioned, I thought this was really good. One of my participants finished her PhD in 5 years. And she said, I really needed to do it because the area I was talking about was new when I started. But by the time I was kind of 5 years into it, suddenly a lot of other people were talking about this. I needed to get mine over the line first. So I think there's that issue about, the balancing it in the context of other parts of your life, which I think, again, will relate. Anybody who's doing doctoral studies can relate to. Be they full-time, part-time, doctoral education. It's our lives are messy, no matter what stage of life we're at. But it's that thing of if you're in an area that's new and your PhD is relevant and you need to get it out there, the 5 to 6 years for some can actually be a barrier. Particularly those who are embedded in an environment where they're gathering their data, they have participants who can contribute to this. So there's that kind of tension, I suppose. And for others, it was, look, I'm taking a couple of years out, I have family, or I have elderly parents, or I've changed job, or I have a lot going on. So there was no model length of time for doing a PhD or finishing it or completing it, but mine all did, and I found that very encouraging. And I was sitting at home with my laptop thinking, here's the stories of people who did it. It was so motivating.
I'd like to discuss with you the concept of wellness and well-being. And we know that that's a really hot topic across really all ages and stages of living and learning at this point. But what are some of the issues with wellness that part-time PhDs face? And have you seen differences in their experiences, throughout your research?
I think the part-time PhD learners, because they have been overlooked in research and policy and are coming in a different position in relation to the academic institution, provide that flavor or in a kind of contribution to discussions. But the idea of wellness, I think it's really across the board for anybody doing a PhD. I think the problem across the board is the idea that once you reach PhD stage, there's what I think it's called impression management. Is that terrible fear of saying that you're not on top of things, that maybe other people are doing better than you, that constant feeling of imposter syndrome and failure. And I think that's across the board. Like, it's such a leap to do level 10 doctoral studies. It's such a leap. And I think the issue of isolation is really key, whether you're full-time or part-time. I think academic isolation for a part-time PhD candidate is really key. That if you're outside of the academic institution and you don't have that access, and you don't have that sense of belonging, you don't have others around you in any way to guide your process and your progress, that academic isolation is very, very, sort of very scary and very real. Equally, I think the pressures of family and pretending everything's going okay are the secret world of the part-time PhD. A lot of people doing a part-time PhD, there's an issue of legitimacy. It's, well, I am not going to tell anybody about this now because I mightn't actually complete, and sure, they don't know, and sure, the job will carry on. Nobody will be the wiser. There's definitely that piece there. I'm like, don't ask me about it, the in-laws or anything. I really don't want to discuss it because it's like a hidden part of life. But in terms of the part-time PhDs, there's that nobody's going to see whether it's going well or not, and you may not say it. And the person physically not being there and maybe not linking into the services. I mean, one of my part-time participants said, I'm a 40-year-old man. I'm not sure I'd go to the counselling service. If I had a problem, I'd probably go elsewhere, which is a real shame because the counselling service is such a wonderful resource. And, it's absolutely used to dealing with all ages and levels of students and all backgrounds. So that's one piece from the part-timers. From the full-timers, the wellness piece that I think is very hidden again, as if you're around other people and you have a community, if everybody seemed to be doing all right, you might keep it to yourself that you're not. And I'm hearing a lot of stories now, perhaps because of the research that I'm doing, from full-timers and part-timers, about the stories of, you know what, I was actually broke there for 2 months and I was really, really struggling. I wasn't coming into college because I really didn't want to get caught up into lunches and things like that where I'd have to pay for stuff. And I just disappeared and I was struggling. And I think that wellness piece, my PhD deals with that interaction with the academic institution, both face to face and online at different stages of the PhD, but agency and resilience and what the learner themselves needs to do to progress. And I think it's about a meeting of those two things, providing the resources and the information to help that learner, no matter whether they're full-time or part-time, to link in and giving them resources to progress and maybe be aware what their red flag issues are, as in, I'm disengaging from this PhD, I'm dodging meeting my supervisor, I'm hiding myself in work. We can all find ways to procrastinate, or I'm keeping hidden those bits of me that are struggling. Yeah. And I'm sure I can skate along.
You don't want other people to think that you're not successful, or so there's a lot of things that we mentally deal with. You talked about imposter syndrome, in that idea of feeling like I wasn't at the same level as so-and-so who was a year ahead of me, or I wasn't at the same level, or this person, oh my goodness, they speak amazingly at a presentation and I'm all tongue-tied, all the time, or those types. And that struggle, or that idea of feeling like I don't add up or I don't level up to others, firstly, and secondly, heaven forbid they should know that I am struggling, or that I have a need, or that I have €5 to my name until the end of the month, or whatever it may be, and not wanting others to know. And again, me having that network and being surrounded by that, but somebody who's a part-time PhD, I can imagine that those issues and those concerns are probably even, tenfold, even more for them, because, they don't have somebody to say, no, it's all right, I've been there. There's been many a times where you just want to throw the covers over your head and say, I am not dealing with this, or I'm just going to throw this away and I'm going to quit. I'm done. I can't do this, for whatever the host of reasons it is. So there's definitely something to be said about the importance of promoting and providing supports for wellness and well-being for PhDs, again, whether part-time or full-time. It's so important. It's so important, because why do we all struggle in the darkness when we do know we have others, that can support us and encourage us and help us through that? One of the key aspects from reading and knowing a bit about your research that's come to the surface through your research was the role of personal agency, resilience. You talked a little bit about that earlier, and seeking help, again, either face-to-face or online, as influencing their progression and their completion. And your participants had really different stories about how they went on this journey. And to me, this is a really fascinating thing. So can you expand a little bit more on this for me?
Well, I suppose, again, it's like the fingerprint, that people's ways of experiencing challenges and overcoming them or harnessing supports was very, very different. Like I said, that example of agency of the learner who really had no interaction with anybody because of not being able to go into the university during the day, and then not working in an environment or personally knowing anybody. So her agency was, okay, I got to get through this somehow, and she plugged into the forums. So that was her example. For another learner, it was really, I think this is very untapped. She was very reflective. And she said that she kept a reflection diary of how her progress was going. And she talked about unconscious incompetence. You don't know what you don't know. And I think that's huge in terms of agency, that if you're not keeping a kind of a reflective diary of your progress and your process, you can kind of float along in the dark without knowing that you're really off track. And so she said, I realized that I didn't know anything about, she was using a quantitative method, I'm thinking, I really didn't know anything about this method, and I didn't know anybody in my institution to ask, and I was working and nobody knew how I would access this. So in terms of personal agency, she went and found out a training provider who delivered this type of training, set up a petition online, got other people, both full-timers and part-timers that she knew, to send it around and get them to sign this form to get a trainer in, and then organized a trainer to come into college that was funded by a department or by maybe some advocacy or student body for PhD and postgrad students. And so that was what she did. She got her the bodies on the ground to support to get this training in. And I think that's now become part and parcel. I'm not sure, but I think it might be part and parcel of the way the institution works. Another was just a personal story. I just loved her story. She was like, I'm sitting here, I have the cup of coffee, the laptop, and the baby monitor. And if I'm lucky, I'm going to get an hour work done. So her personal agency was in terms of really shoehorning her time into these really concentrated periods of work because life was busy elsewhere. Another of my participants said that she used to get the train home and that's when she'd do her work. And she said, I was so focused sometimes that I nearly missed my stop. So agency can be either seeking help from others, reflecting on where things are falling short and maybe that you need to be more proactive, or drawing on your own personal skills, which a lot of us will have developed from work in terms of time management, project management, completing a task. Another of my participants, I loved this, she kind of treated her writing the PhD like a game. I think it was called Countdown. It used to be a quiz show, or there's one show, The Weakest Link, and you'd answer a question, you go in the bank, and you'd bank all the time as you went along. So she used to write 1,000 words and she'd say, I'm banking that in the bank. And then on a Sunday morning, her husband would let her off the hook and say, listen, don't bother about coming over to my folks now for dinner. You stay here and do your work. So she'd take her stuff out of the bank and she would then work on doing a concentrated period of writing. So the very different ways that people demonstrated resilience and reflected on what was going well or not well really shaped their experience. Some of them were just pure tough. I mean, I used to hear people's stories, and when I, kind of over the last year during lockdown, when it is quite isolation, I still remember one of my participants saying, oh yeah, my car got broken into and my computer got stolen. Oh yeah, and all my data it crashed. And just, a series of catalogue of horrors, but she was so cool and she got it in and she did it. And that's very motivating to hear. And I think we don't hear those stories of getting through. Just finally, one of my participants, she went to a conference, a European conference, and she really noticed this group of PhD researchers in Europe were really firing ahead. They were publishing. There was an explicit expectation that they would publish. And they were disseminating the research. They were very strong on methods. They would give each other mock vivas all through the process to see how they were getting on. And she joined them. And even though she was physically located in Ireland, physically in a job and then separately doing a PhD, that was her network that she engaged with remotely in terms of, demonstrating agency to seek help remotely, but progress with the academic process. So there's huge different ways, but I think this really needs to be captured because it's lost on the academic institution side, maybe, that there isn't a dynamic discussion happening between those who have gone through a PhD or are going through it and the academic institution, because there's a bank of huge support and goodwill within the institution. And the time is ripe now that we need to capture this. So bridging that gap between Zoom and room, as I call it.
Yes, between Zoom and room, that's beautiful. So we have to remind ourselves and to remind each other that every little bit, every step forward is a success. And so if you're writing 100 words or, you've put a sentence that packs a punch on paper and then you don't do anything for 2 weeks, you've still taken a step forward and you're still advancing and you're still a success, and you shouldn't get discouraged. And, and I think that there's something to be said about some of these stories that you're telling, because in everything that you're saying, I hear myself. I'm thinking, oh, that was me. Like we can so identify with, like you said, rich stories and narratives that need to be shared and to get out there so that we can be encouraged by each other and to encourage each other and those who come along in the future as well. Maeve, what are some, what surprised you most about through your analysis and the themes that emerged? What was the most surprising elements for you?
I was very surprised, I suppose, about the role of work, about the nature of the work environment, being a supportive place for the learner. There's not much written about part-time doctoral candidates, but work is more seen as, well, the learner has a value because they have experience of working, and they can bring that to the research. And also, it's great to have somewhere that your boss might be flexible or kind, or your colleagues might give you time off. But again, I think there's a bigger piece about how the culture of your work environment supports you and can help you as a part-time PhD candidate in the absence maybe of that interaction on a regular basis with the academic communities in the university. So that really surprised me. I think there's a lot of work to be done there, particularly as I think there's a goal now. I think it was the Strategy 2030 document in Ireland, that we want to look at more flexible ways to support online learners, working learners, part-time, mature, and then increase enrollments at doctoral level. With the establishment of the new technological universities, I think there's a goal that at least 45% of staff, academic staff, should have a doctoral level qualification, either PhD, doctorate in education, professional doctorate. So if you have institutions where the goal is to encourage more staff to do PhDs, isn't this very useful to know, well, what's it like to do and what can we learn? So that was really key. I think the thing about the role of the blogs and the online resources, and how dynamically the student engaged, or my PhD completed learners engaged with these resources that were nothing to do with their academic institution, is really interesting. And I think maybe that's something that the academic institutions could look at, is to create this kind of dynamic interaction. Because a lot of participants found that maybe it was hard to find information online or interpret guidelines. It was maybe okay if things were going right, but if things were going wrong, or there was a change in your own plans, or a change in your supervisory relationship, maybe a supervisor retired or moved to another university, it was difficult to navigate that space online or to find it. And that seemed to have to be mediated through human contact, maybe a friend or a colleague, or God knows who you would find to do that. So I think from the institutional point of view, the value of these online and resources, and to look at even the documents and the way that information is presented, to be more dynamic, to energize that person who's on a computer at 10 o'clock after a long day's work, to connect them in, both in terms of the way that the information is presented, but to allow them to interact and engage as well. That it's not dependent on the 9 to 5 piece. Like, I did think that story of having to take a day off work and go down physically to say, lads, I'm not going till this sorted, it is a piece that surprised me. The resilience surprised me, but the resilience of any of us who've gone through doctoral education surprised me that we're still doing it. They're wonderful stories, and they need to be captured. For me, I think what surprised me is how it was lucky that I fell upon doing the part-time completed PhD learner, which again, as I said, emerged from my preliminary study, that this experience, the learner could reflect on each stage they'd gone through and say, yes, this did work or this didn't, versus people like me at mid-stage at the time who didn't know. But it was like having my own invisible mentors, that I could hear the voices of my participants and the resources that they recommended, and the funny stories and the anecdotes and the encouragement. It really was so invaluable to me. And I think that's maybe another piece, whether you're full-time or part-time, because I do think there's a lot of students who are very isolated at the moment who are doing a PhD. Now, it doesn't matter, as I said, if they're in Galway or Ghana, if you're not physically able to contact or connect with the university. My best friend's son is sitting at home in his sitting room doing his first year in college, in a kind of a science-based course, and working part-time elsewhere. His experience is more like mine as a middle-aged woman than mine was as an undergraduate. So we really need to look at those learners' worlds and map them back in to have that kind of dialogue with the academic institutions, and making things kind of vibrant and connected.
Yeah. So what are some things that you hope will change as a result of your finding?
I really hope that I hope that it will start becoming part of conversations that are already happening, like universal design learning and inclusion and engagement of learners. These conversations are really, really happening. And in the light of COVID and the fact that we're all absent from a physical campus, I think I hope that my research adds to these stories, to contribute to not just understanding, as I said, who learners are, whether they're full-time, part-time, mature, international, working, whatever, but where they are and what else is going on in their lives. I think that I really want this discussion to happen. I think there's something about kind of human-centered design there, that you're looking at an individual and you're hearing their stories and their life, and you're not just thinking, okay, I'm here on campus in my particular office or my space or whatever. But I'm also thinking of, well, somebody is at home in Italy, or somebody is working full time, or somebody is full time but has just had a family member with a disability, or a personal issue in life, or even the richness of what those different experiences can bring to doing a PhD. And that's what I'd like to happen, is more dynamic interaction and gathering those stories. There's a whole world there that COVID has really brought to light, and we're all learners at a distance. And that's what I really want my research to add to those discussions.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. What can the community that a part-time PhD researcher or even a full-time PhD researcher is surrounded by, what can they do, if anything, to support someone who's working on their PhD?
Well, I think, again, that really depends on the position of that learner themselves within their own lives. And I think maybe more encouragement from academic university or academic institutions to make visible this part-time PhD learner. So a part-time candidate will maybe tell their family and their friends, I am actually doing a PhD at the moment, I am actually struggling, and tell their colleagues. Or again, make it more explicit that, the learner themselves has a role in progressing their studies and finding the way that you're not on your own. Because I think the worst thing, no matter who you are or where you are, is if you don't have any reference point, any community outside yourself, not just to support you psychologically, but to help you to progress through those academic hurdles within the PhD, which are very challenging to produce original research. So I think that's a piece that needs to be done. So tell your family, tell your friends, seek help, go to the counselling service, connect, be it online or face-to-face, whatever you can do, but also for institutions to make visible these diverse learners. I mean, one of my participants said it doesn't matter whether you're in San Francisco, Dubai, or Bondi Beach, information should be accessible regardless of where the learner is 24/7, and there should be a way to engage. So that's one piece. I think the other piece then is about making part-timers and diverse learners' experience more visible on websites, and also getting learners and people from the community in to talk to PhD candidates, and not just academics. But I read a book recently, and the guy was a journalist, but he was a brilliant interviewer. Why don't we get people like that to come in and talk to PhD learners about how to interview? Make this really living research. Get people who finish their PhDs to do what you're doing now. Come and talk about these experiences or share them in some way. Like a podcast is brilliant. So creating those communities, as well as assuming that the learner will have access to them within their own personal life or their working life or the institution. It has to be quite intentional and explicit, I think, to keep the PhD as a viable and attractive venture for learners who may be scattered all around the world, but doing a PhD in an institution in Ireland, or working, or with all these different things going on in life.
Now, I guess what I want to ask you is, now that you're at the end of your PhD journey, what are your own plans moving forward? What do you plan on doing now that you've got this almost completely behind you?
I don't know. I mean, I have to say I'm really interested in this whole idea of universal design learning, and I loved your conversation with Dr. Margaret Flood?
Yep.
So this whole issue of inclusion, engagement, and connecting that learner in who may not be visible within a physical campus or may not have presence. It's so relevant nowadays. I'm just kind of sitting and watching this space. If I could turn myself into 15 people, I'd do more on the PhDs, I'd do more on first years, their experience in college and COVID, the mammies, the learners, the daddies, the workers, the teachers, and the children. What hasn't been looked at, the socially and physically distanced learner in terms of inclusion, face-to-face and online. So that's the shape, I suppose, roughly of where I am now, where I go.
I'm hoping that our conversation today didn't actually scare off any prospective people that want to do PhDs in the future. So what I would like to do is ask you, for our listeners today, if they're just beginning their PhD journey or they're just interested in getting started, whether part-time or full-time, do you have any resources or recommendations, toolkits that you can provide, some things that you can point them in the direction to get started to encourage and support them?
Well, I'd say the first thing, if you're starting a PhD, and this is something an academic said to me, is think about your burning question. What is your burning question? And why are you doing this? What do you hope to get out of it? Because if you literally just want doctor before your name, it's not going to sustain you through those, through the life cycle of a PhD. It's a long process. So I think the first thing is burning question. What's your burning question? And how do you keep it alive? So keeping it alive, it's about two things. It's about interaction with the academic processes and communities within the academic institution and the online resources, and then agency. What are you doing yourself to progress your study? And is that informed by other people who are familiar and experienced with this? Because there's no point, and it's wonderful to moan to your poor friends who can sit there and nod smilingly, but you have to in some way plug yourself into that world, be it online or face to face. These are the resources that I find really helpful. One is called How to Write a Thesis by Rowena Murray. And she talks a lot about binge writing and snack writing. And I think that's really helpful. The little small pockets of writing are just really can energize you and add value to your overall finished thesis as the big chunks. So you don't have to do stuff in big chunks, because that's very intimidating if you're part-time and you don't have much time. So think, and equally you think for full-timers, to bring it into those small chunks. So I think that's really helpful. In terms of the blogs, there's one by an academic called Pat Thompson called Patter, and I love her blog. There's another one called Viva Survivors, and again I found that extremely helpful. But I think try and find something that suits you and suits your story. There's an awful lot out there about the academic writing process and about going through a PhD. But I mean, I know I've had ones that I recommended to people or they've recommended to me and they just haven't quite fitted. So trust yourself, trust, your style of working and writing, but do reflect and review. I think keeping a reflective journal is a great idea. What's working, what's not working, why, what next, and what different. Even just those small questions. So that's what I'd say, and balance it up with other stuff.
Now, I'd like to know if you have any tips, tricks, or final words for someone to encourage them who to say to them and help them finish that PhD.
I think in terms of finishing the PhD, and this is quite hard during COVID, but I set yourself some goal, even that you're going to attend some conference, some situation that forces you to write. I think particularly even a short presentation, those 5-minute presentations where you have to do 5 slides in 5 minutes, they're a great way for focusing your research, giving you a goal to go through, connecting, I think, with WhatsApp groups. If you've anybody in your circle at all who's doing a PhD, connect in with them, read each other's work. We have a wonderful person in our WhatsApp group who set us a goal of 100 days. 100 days of your PhD, so even maybe 20 days or 30 days, and set yourself small goals, and they have to be meaningful and have an output, that you have to share it with somebody afterwards. You have to produce something or done something different, and take lots of breaks and give yourself rewards. So don't make it hell, really don't. Make it as pleasant as possible, and link in with the services. If you have access to any kind of supportive network as a PhD candidate, or you keep yourself connected through conferences or whatever way, just keep it a living process. Don't have it sitting in the corner gathering dust and in your mind for months and months, because you will drive yourself mad, particularly in this world of COVID where we can be quite isolated physically.
Yeah, wonderful. And definitely surround yourself by people who are going to build you up and not tear you down. Maeve, it has been an absolute pleasure talking to you about your research. And again, I'm so excited for you. Congratulations on your successful Viva again.
Oh, thanks, Shelley. It's a pleasure. And thank you so much for asking me. This has really helped plug me in now.
Very good. All right, we'll chat again soon. Thanks, Maeve.
Brilliant.
I hope that you've enjoyed this discussion on A Dash of Salt. a space where you'll always find fresh and current discussions on society and learning today, seasoned with just the right touch of experts in education and a dash of sociological imagination. Please be sure to like and share this episode, and don't forget to subscribe to A Dash of Salt on Podbean so that you don't miss the next episode. Thanks so much, and we'll chat again soon.